Welcome to the presentation, Who Hacks and Why, What Everyone Should Know. Now the timing of this video is being recorded during a period of time that I'm referring to as He Who Cannot Be Named. And because it is being recorded during that period of time, I am not going to be allowing comments for probably anywhere from 6 months to a year, depending on how long the attention to this goes. A big reason for that is, unfortunately, some people are using He Who Cannot Be Named as let's say, as a grounds for marketing content, even related to things like cybersecurity, digital security. And so it's not appropriate, I think, in my viewpoint, to do that, because I think a lot of the people who are searching for He Who Cannot Be Named or looking for information on that, they're looking at it for health reasons. They're not looking at it for other reasons related to people trying to market content. So I find it very disingenuous to do that, and that's part of the reason why I don't want this to be picked up by any algorithm that thinks that's what this is about, because it's not. And I don't think it's genuine for people to be doing that. Another thing, too, is I recognize diversions when I see one. And as the classic middle child, I don't tend to like to talk about things that everybody is talking about because there's seldom any truth in those discussions. So what we're going to actually be looking at in this video, though that will come back, there will be a point on that related to something else. We're going to be looking at the four main groups of hackers. These are not the only groups of hackers, but the four main groups of hackers. We're going to be looking at why hackers do what they do, or some of these groups do. We're definitely going to be covering some misconception about hackers or hacker groups. And then I'm going to recommend some resources. And of course, one of the things that I'll discuss is we're looking at some of the why and the who. We're not discussing any type of security techniques. So I do cover that in the Skillshare course, the Consumer Guide to Digital Security. So we look at some preliminary security steps, some principles of security, and then time-relevant security topics. For instance, there is a topic coming in this month, May of 2020, and I highly suggest people look at that. Skillshare is a platform that is premium subscription-based, so if you're already a premium student, you get unlimited access to all of their courses, and I believe they have over 1,000. So that being said, it's something that I recommend if you're looking at techniques to prevent hacks. This is looking at who the hackers are and what motivates them. And so this is appropriate for people who may be in your executive suite. This may be appropriate for people on your middleware side, your front-end side, or your back-end side. And that's one of the reasons why I'm going to be putting this in the security playlist, but I'm also going to be putting it in the SQL Server virtual user group meetup. And that is because I think that whether you're a DBA or whether you're a developer, whether you're an ETL developer, any of those individuals, you should be aware of who your opponent is in the security world and why they exist. And that will help you in development. Same thing with data architecture. Whether you're architecting solutions, maybe you shouldn't, or maybe you should, or maybe you should consider some things. So let's first of all understand the why. And when we discuss why hackers do what they do, we're discussing incentives. I'm going to give a resource that I suggest in a second about incentives. But number one, if we know why, we may be able to disincentivize or to counter-incentivize, okay? And I put here, one of the misconceptions here about incentives is that we can't avoid a situation in which we might have an opponent. And that's not correct. There are certain, I should say, development techniques, or there are certain development ideas that hackers are just flat out not interested, and we see this. And so, yes, you might be able to avoid them completely because you might be developing something that they don't even care about. Okay. We also, number two, we should know when we've been beaten as early as possible. This is like entering into a battle that we'll lose. People who are good at security typically study war as well, and that's because there's a lot of parallels between protecting yourself in terms of security as well as protecting yourself in terms of war. And one of the strategies in war is don't enter into a battle that you're going to lose right off the bat. Okay, keep in mind, hackers don't have to play by the rules. Okay, this is a warning on compliance. Compliance is something you have to comply with. It is not something that hackers have to comply with. And let's say a good percentage of compliance rules actually favor the hacker over you. They don't actually do anything to help you at all. And that's because the people who come up with compliance, it doesn't really matter whether it's effective or not. Again, they're oftentimes bureaucrats, and they're going to get paid regardless of whether it's effective. And then number three, we may re-architect solutions depending on the incentives by our opponent. So depending on who our opponent may be, we may want to re-architect our solutions. So one of the books that I would recommend on this is a book in terms of incentives, is a book by Thomas Sowell called Basic Economics. And although people will get distracted by some of the content in the book, the key takeaways in this book that I think he does a better job covering than anyone is the concept of incentives and the concept of the law of unintended consequences. Now, although this is an economics book, understand that incentives and the law of unintended consequences affect tech. So I don't think those are only economic concepts. I think they affect a lot of different industries, a lot of different areas of life outside of just economics. But I do think that he does the best job covering both of those. Again, don't get distracted by some of the other content. Some people will. Focus on learning those two concepts, okay? So from architecture to development, few consider the incentives or unintended consequences of either. And a story related to this was I was working at this one private company. This was a long time ago, and one of the individuals at that private company used to work in, let's say, as a military contractor. And he was explaining how military contracts worked, where if they went under budget, let's say their budget was $1 million and they only spent $800,000, the next year they were punished by having a lower budget. And so they were encouraged to go over the budget each year. So if their budget was $1 million, they were encouraged to go to 1.2 million or 1.3 million. And the reason is because the next year they were given a larger budget and then a larger budget. Well, that's a great example of incentives in action, right? And what's interesting there as well is it also sets into motion some unintended consequences, because going over budget constantly is not something that's feasible in the long run. And so while that is a government contract, that money is coming from somewhere. In fact, that's one of the reasons why he didn't want to work at the private company. Private companies are much stricter. If you go over budget all the time, you might not have a job. And so it's important to understand incentives and unintended consequences, because when we're talking about hackers, we want to know what motivates them. And we also want to know, based on how we're developing a solution around that, if there's any unintended consequences to our solution. So the first type of hacker is what I refer to as the self-motivated hacker. Now, other people will refer to these as script kiddies or amateur hackers. And this is one of the major misunderstandings or misconceptions. I don't think it's a smart idea to refer to people as script kiddies or amateur hackers, because as we've seen with these self-motivated hackers, they can do very sophisticated hacks. They're very good at what they do. And I don't think disparaging them is a very wise idea. For one, if you have an enemy, you don't want the enemy to exist because you're disrespecting them, right? So self-motivated hacker is a very respectful term because they are self-motivated, okay? And I think script kiddies and amateur hackers is a very bad idea to call them, because, again, that can kind of draw their wrath, for lack of a better word. So why are they very potent? Or why are they very dangerous? Well, for one, a lot of them have nothing to lose, right? They could be bored. They could want money. They could want to destroy. They could want to have fun, maybe. Vendetta, because of the recent layoffs due to he who could not be named. There might be people with a vendetta, right? So that gives a person's motivation. They also could be demonstrating something. They could have a chip on their shoulder. There's any number of reasons that motivate these hackers. Now think about that from a disincentive perspective. They're going to be the hardest to disincentivize, right? And one of the worst examples that I list here that I saw, and without going into too much detail, but a person was going to pass away soon and engaged in a hack of a company. Well, the problem is that person wouldn't be deterred by prison or anything like that because they're going to pass away soon, right? If you're at the tail end of your life, it doesn't matter. So that's a good example of somebody with nothing to lose. It's the worst kind of enemy to have. So it's next to impossible to disincentivize these hacks. And then disclosing information or selling information can be a precursor to these hacks. So be careful about that, because, again, it's depending on the information you're disclosing, or even selling information can be. And another misconception about self-motivated hackers is that they're always direct, and that's not correct. They can also be indirect as well. So they can be direct hacks on a company, let's say, to destroy the company, or they can be indirect, and they can find out things and then engage in the hack. Whatnot. So here's two examples from the media. One of them is the Telegraph here. We had a British 15-year-old gained access to intelligence operations in Afghanistan, pretending to be the head of the CIA. And then there was a teenager who hacked the CIA director's email, and he talks about how he did it. So there are, again, these individuals have different motivations for that, and you can look that up and see. It may just be simple boredom, but it could be something far worse, and that's very hard to disincentivize. The next group of hackers are going to be the organizational hackers. So these are groups of individuals, this could be collective or decentralized, that hack. And they can perform a function involved in the hack, each perform a function, I should say. That's why they can be very dangerous, right? Because they're coordinated. And you can have somebody do DDoS attacks. You could have somebody engage in SQL injection. You can have this coordination going on between them that can make it very potent. They can do all kinds of like diversions, right? You can be focusing on X when really they're hitting you at Y and Z. They seldom involve money. Information or agenda can be a big target or reason why, right? So it could be your agenda, right? It could be the information you have. But these don't generally involve money. And money, a lot of times, not always, but money a lot of times can be used as a diversion for what these individuals are doing. So they can say, hey, we want you to pay us, but really that's just a distraction of what's going on. So examples of this include terrorist organizations, environmental and political groups, social justice groups. Groups like Anonymous, for instance, are organizational hackers. A story of this for myself was I used to run a site about demographics, and the last person I interviewed on that site was an individual who admitted to engaging in a lot of, what's the term that would, social manipulation and social media manipulation and social engineering. And she didn't state that they were hacking, but it was almost implied by some of the things that she was saying. And they had reasons for it. They had a certain agenda, and definitely I have a lot of respect for people who have their agendas and why. I question the ethics of some of what they were doing. But I will say that one of the reasons why I removed that site is I realize that, especially in demographics, there can be a lot of people that use that information for the wrong reasons. And there's a good reason to put up a barrier of entry for some information. In fact, one of the reasons why I have certain courses the way I do is because I don't want the average person to get access to those. It doesn't need to be free. There needs to be a barrier of entry. Somebody needs to kind of prove themselves. And a payment, for instance, there's usually an identity associated with that. And so it was a great example of she had some techniques that they were using, and it was a good interview. And she was willing to put it out there publicly, so I assume everything she was discussing had to be legal because she was openly stating she was doing that. But it was an organizational group, fundamentally, and they were after an agenda. If you were on the opposite side of their agenda, they would go after you, and that's the way that they functioned. And depending on, how wrong they thought you were, they might engage in some pretty extreme manipulation. The professional hacker is another group of hackers, and this is usually companies or individuals. It could be individuals at companies, but it's companies worldwide that often engage in attacks with domestic competitors or foreign competitors. And there's a misconception that it doesn't occur domestically. I've heard people state that this only occurs with foreign companies. And it's like, no, actually it can occur domestically. We'll see an example of that in a second. As I mentioned earlier, a gay foreshadowing about compliance. Compliance often opens doors to hacking. This is another misconception about compliance. It keeps us safe, maybe. But maybe what it does is it sets into motion some unintended consequences where hackers can find new ways around things. And so one of my good friends, she's very exceptional in the healthcare field. She works in healthcare data. But she has told me numerous times that the compliance in healthcare is actually a bigger problem and opens more doors to hacking than anything else. And she's exactly right about that. It's compliance is, and they make a lot of money in healthcare, but the problem is a lot of their rules are just not good at all. So why are professional hackers so potent? Well, first of all, they understand the industry, especially marketing, right? Think about what companies put on their LinkedIn or website about jobs, right? So let's say they say, we're an AWS platform. Well, I mean, that says a lot. If you're a hacker, you know a lot about that company if they're an AWS platform. Or if they say, we use Oracle databases. Again, if you're a hacker, you know a lot about that, right? So you understand that industry. If you're in a related industry, you probably understand it quite a bit. The big target here is intellectual property generally. It can be money, as we'll see, like competition, but it can also be intellectual property, especially if it's foreign. And so money is mostly involved either directly or indirectly. And consider again, go to LinkedIn if you don't believe me, or their websites and their career pages. Think about how many companies list new hire requirements on this stuff, right? They're constantly talking about themselves in their attempt to market themselves, and they're not thinking about the unintended consequences of that. It's the same thing with people that are putting stuff on their resume. You have to be very careful what you put on your resume. You might be giving information that you shouldn't. One of my favorite things to say in interviews is, "It's sorry, but it's none of your business," right? Like, and it's because they'll want details like, "So what was that company?" Well, I can't tell you. I mean, we can talk about like how I went about developing a tool, but I'm not going to talk about like specifically what the tool was, and I'm not going to talk about the company or the clients or anything like that. That's all private information that should not be revealed even in a job interview. And so here's a couple of examples. This was a individual who hacked a competitor's business to get information on accounts. And then here was an example, a story that I had heard between two companies. So company A was selling contracts to company B. So company B was the buyer. They wanted these contracts to do well. And company A was basically shorting these contracts. Well, company B didn't know that company A was on the other side of the contract. And they were also shorting company A. Well, because of a hack, they were able to identify that the person on the opposite side of the contract was company A. So they engaged in something which was totally legal at the time, and that resulted, for those of you who don't know, contracts are usually, there's a time period in which they expire, and so these contracts didn't expire in that time period, which meant that company A took a beating in two ways. They lost money on the contract, but company B also made money shorting company A. And so that all occurred because of a hack in corporate America. Another one, this is generally assumed to be the next group, but there have been people I've heard that have said that this is a professional. I think this is probably a intelligence agency, but that would be the Bangladesh bank robbery. You can look at this, but and get more information on it. But this involved central banks, right? So these hacks can be huge. And this one down here, you can see 650 million pounds that hackers were able to steal. To my knowledge, up to this point, and again, this is in May 2020, this is the largest hack that I am aware of. So, I mean, 650 million pounds is a decent amount of money. This one was $101 million, if I recall, and they were able to illegally transfer money from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So the last group is intelligence agencies, and of the major groups, I should say, that we're going to be talking about. So the misconception with intelligence agencies is that you can protect against these. And the good news is you can't. So you don't have to worry about intelligence agencies. The very bad news, though, is that if you are on their radar, you have done something serious, right? You don't want to be on these individuals' radar at all. Okay, and so one of the stories I have here is I was at it's a mix between finance and tech meetup, and there was an individual there that ran a business. And it's a very interesting business that attracts a type of audience. And he was ranting about, let's say, intelligence officials visiting him. And he was very frustrated by this. And I just pointed out to him, I was like, I understand the frustration, but you have to realize that that type of business is going to attract, intelligence individuals. And you don't really want to be in that type of business because that's going to attract those individuals. So that's something that I would say, especially with architecture. If this is a risk for you, you might want to rethink your business or your architecture or whatever it is you're doing or your idea, right? You really don't want to be on the opposite end of this. So this is a video that I suggest you watch on YouTube, and I'm not going to provide a link in the description mainly because a lot of people will view it as political, and it's not. In fact, the politics in the video is the diversion. The actual meat of this video is toward the end. This individual here states that he had worked at the NSA, and he says, if we want to get into your system, we can. We can get into any system in the world. I'm paraphrasing what he says. And so notice, by the way, people are going to be distracted about the politics in the video, but they're not going to pay attention to some of the meat in the video. And that is very interesting what he's saying. Now remember, this is what he's asserting. And there's another assertion on, Wikipedia, called the tailored access operations. I learned about this in the documentary I'm going to discuss in a second. And tailored access operations is something that the NSA, at least Wikipedia, is asserting they have the capability of. So I would highly suggest that you look that up and research that information. That is something that, again, this next documentary talks about. But this video is very interesting, I think, because it's a great example of how people will get distracted by one thing, when in reality there's a very important assertion being stated in that video. So one documentary that I would suggest on this, and one resource, would be 0 Days. If you're an Amazon Prime member, I believe at one point this was free, and sometimes Amazon Prime, they do allow documentaries to be free for a period of time. So the big takeaways here, if you watch this, would be to take notes on Eric and Liam and their points on cybersecurity. They are the two guys that were researching this heavily. And then, of course, there's discussion by military personnel. And I think that the discussion by the military personnel is very fascinating as well. So I highly recommend pay very close attention to what they're saying. And then consider throughout the video, as people are talking about what's going on and what's happening, just the risks that everyday people do, that nobody is thinking about involve all these potential compromises. And I point here that, pending he who cannot be named, depending on what happens this year, I may be able to host a public showing of this for people interested. This would be in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. But I do not know, because with he who cannot be named right now, it is causing everyone to act kind of frizzy, for lack of a better word. And I hate to say this, but even after it passes, I think there's going to be a period of time in which people just don't want to do anything publicly. We'll see if that's correct or not. But if that's the case, it's going to be really hard to get a venue. It's going to be very difficult, but it is something I try to do once a year, to host this to where people can see it, and we have a discussion for an hour. It's about 2 hours long, but I may not be able to do that depending on what happens with he who cannot be named. So just as a review, in this video, we have discussed the main 4 groups of hackers and why they exist. Again, are there other groups of hackers? Yes, but these are the 4 main groups. Usually hackers are going to fall into one of these groups. We've also looked at some of the misconceptions of these groups, along with compliance, along with some of what people think about maybe the incentives behind them. And then, of course, there have been some resources that I highly suggest in this, from the documentary to the book. Definitely look at those. And that way you're prepared for when you think about, when you're designing something or when you're developing something, you're thinking about who could potentially be my opponent and what could potentially be their motivations.